Welcome to another episode of From Startup to Wunderbrand with Nicholas Kuhne.
So, hello everyone, and I'm very excited to welcome back Jason Voiovich, one of my favorite authors. In our last discussion, we chatted about his fantastic and now very relevant book, which is Marketer in Chief, How Each President Sold the American Idea. So I'm going to put a link so that you can go to that interview and have a look at it. That was fantastic. And we might touch on that a little bit later in this episode. But in that episode, we discussed a book that was in concept stage and almost ready to be launched. And now it has been launched. And I'm super excited to have gone through it as well. It's called Booze, Babe, and the Little Black Dress, How Innovators of the Roaring Twenties Created the Consumer Revolution. And we're living with the results of it now. So we're going to have a good discussion with Jason about some of the key topics and just an overview to whet your appetite so that you can read this book and understand how consumerism started and what is the logical next step. So Jason, welcome back.
Oh, thank you. It is great to be back. I think, there are going to be a lot of people speaking from now until November about the U.S. presidential election. So for sure we can touch on that later. That's no problem.
It's great for the algorithm. We've got to get onto that bandwagon. So
That's true. That's true. I'd be a pretty poor marketer if I didn't understand that.
Exactly. But you've got this new book out, and I went through the overview, and I'm just going to read it quickly so that folks can understand what we're going to be talking about. This book retells the history of the Roaring Twenties from a consumer's point of view. That decade saw an explosion of options for the average person, not just consumer products, but also information and entertainment. The 1920s transformed Americans into choice makers, not just consumers. And let's maybe talk about that difference between a choice maker versus a consumer. What was it like before this huge the Industrial Revolution had been going for 60, 80 years by that stage, maybe a bit longer. How did this change? And specifically in the American context, what changed America into this powerhouse of consumerism?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in there. And I'm glad that you brought up the Industrial Revolution, and because it presents a bit of the history lesson that's important to kind of get us to the 1920s and realize why it was the 1920s and not the 1890s or the 1950s or any other point. Why was it the 1920s exactly? We talked about the Industrial Revolution. Most people from their grammar school or high school, secondary school have some familiarity with that. That's really the idea of mass production. How do you go from individual people building in much more of a cottage industry to the point where you could have large factories churning out lots of repeatable things a lot cheaper? That started in Europe and specifically in the United Kingdom and was embraced with a fervor in the United States not long thereafter. But as you said, the Industrial Revolution and mass production had been going on. What was it that really changed in the 1920s? And you really had two things that were really important. The second, there's kind of a three-part formula. We're going to talk about mass production, mass marketing, and mass finance. So let's talk about, we already talked about mass production. Let's talk about mass marketing. In the 19-teens, most people remember what was the big deal during the 19-teens? The Great War, World War I, as it would be sadly known later, because there was another one. World War I, especially what most people don't realize in the United States, if they're from the EU or they're from somewhere else, is that President Wilson created something called the Committee on Public Information, the CPI. Its job was to sell war bonds to the American public to finance the war. And it was probably the most successful public funding exercise ever before or since. And what was interesting is that it essentially trained an entire generation of public relations, advertising, and marketing professionals en masse in a hurry. And if you remember from your history, the United States didn't enter the war until nearly the end. And it was basically done just as soon as we showed up. We kind of went into the trenches a little bit and overwhelmed the Germans, who are already basically worn out. And we win. The Allies win, huzzah, we all go home. We got the flu and we took it home, and all of that stuff. Well, what were all these people who are now trained in some of the best and most effective advertising and public relations going to do? Well, the business community looked at that and said, I want me some of those guys and those women, to put it bluntly, who were excellent at this stuff. So they started hiring them, and they started looking at this mass production and thinking, we can sell that stuff just in the same way we sold war bonds. So we had mass production now with mass marketing. At about the same time, earlier in that decade, and just at about the same time, the entire American financial system was going through a very rough kind of teenage process, becoming an adult, where it was no longer the J.P. Morgans and the Vanderbilts and the James J. Hills of the world that could save the financial system when it got into a panic. You needed to create something like the very adult Federal Reserve Bank. Central banking became popular at about that time because it had to. The economy was too complex. So you had not only mass production, which had been around for a while, but right away in the 1920s, you had mass marketing, people who were very good at it, and mass finance. You actually had the money in the economy that could help people afford the stuff that they were being sold, because before it was all installment plans or you saved up for it. In the 1920s were the first times you'd get the real explosion of things like installment payment plans at a massive scale. They had existed before, but they were nothing compared to what they were in the 1920s.
And that's how companies like GM, as per your book, took over from the likes of Ford.
Yeah, it is a wonderful case study in exactly what the difference was between Henry Ford was the best that the prior generation could produce. General Motors was kind of a harbinger of things to come, and the difference couldn't be more stark. Henry Ford figured out kind of the mass production side, how to build cars cheap. What most people don't realize is that the Model T was cheaper every year it was out. The last year it was out was actually the cheapest you could buy it. Just crazy when you think about it. It actually got cheaper over time. He was very good at that, had to do very little marketing because it was cheaper and it was available. It was a great little car for its time. What General Motors figured out was that, okay, well, we can just copy his production side. We'll hire these great marketing people who can make people want to sell it. But they realized that Ford kind of was a moralist in addition to a great kind of production person. He thought, hey, you saved up for a car, you bought it, I'm going to make it even cheaper, so why do we need financing? He didn't like finance people. Alfred Sloan and those folks said, people, if I'm going to compete with Ford, I need something different. I need to give people a different way to buy something. And what they created was the General Motors Acceptance Corporation, GMAC, which essentially allowed people to buy in installments. And I mean, today, most people buy a car that way, right? But in the 1920s, it was a brand new thing. And what if, let's say, just imagine yourself, you're in there and you have a new car costs $500, let's say, and you had $50 in your bank. If you went to the Ford dealer would tell you, come back when you have $500. The GM dealer would say, you know what? I'll take $50 down and a promise to pay the rest of it, $10 over the next however many months, and you can drive the car off the lot today. You don't need to be a marketing genius to understand how compelling that was to the average person. Take that situation, repeat it a zillion times in the 1920s, and you start to get an idea of what really happened, what was the driving force, and why it was that decade that really made the transition. By the time you get to the kind of the beginning of the Great Depression, which is an entire other story, the psychology of the country had changed. Yes, people talk about mass consumption, mass marketing, mass production, mass finance led to mass consumption, which is true, but incomplete. we tend to think about consumption as this really negative thing, and it can be a very negative thing. Overconsumption and kind of manipulation, these can be negative things. But what also came at that time was if you had so many things to be able to choose from, what you really needed to be good at was not consumption, it was choice. You had so many different things to choose from. I take you back to 1910, you might have had one type of peanut butter. It's not hard to choose between one type of peanut butter. You pick one. Hey, you go to 1928, and you've got 15 types of peanut butter on the shelf. That's just one tiny example. You have to start to know, well, how do I choose between these different options? And American consumers became choice makers. And that change in psychology that I think was completely unintended, by the way. I don't think Alfred Sloan thought he wanted to create a nation of skeptics and choice makers. That's not what he wanted. But that's what happened, and when you read in his biography, My Years at General Motors, he kind of laments that consumers controlled his company, not him. That if they chose to go somewhere else tomorrow, he's out of business. As simple as that. And we have been living with that ever since. And it's not to say that consumers are all powerful, but I think today we have this feeling in our mind that like, oh, it's big business and big corporations and big this and big that, and they pull our strings and with algorithms, and there's hand waving. There's a lot of hand waving. And we are completely slaves to this, to whatever their machinations are. And the reality is, when you speak with most business people, and I've spoken with hundreds, I know you have as well, we are all at the mercy of consumer choice. And it all dates back to this era. So if you want to understand that kind of choice culture better and how business really works, this is the era to study. That was a long answer, wasn't it, Nicholas?
Yeah, but I mean, you covered so many points there. I mean, one thing I'd love to add in there is maybe logistics, because with the ability, with all of these guys coming back from World War I with knowledge of shipping enormous things across the world into new theaters of war at speed. I mean, there's this term called consilience, which was created by this chap called Martin Raymond in his book, The Tomorrow People. And he's a futurist, and he talks about how you have these enormous dumps in human development or progression by all sorts of things coming together at the same time. It's not just that GM had payments, but the banks were getting better. The marketing was getting better. The cold chain, and I'm going to touch on cold chain a little bit later, and bonds, etc. All of these things, science, technology, education, the taking of the West, the people moving across the United States and becoming sort of a more cohesive whole. All of this allowed this huge boom in the 20s. And you have it with the internet era, the AI era, etc. But it's all of these things have to come together at the perfect time. It's not, that's why some businesses fail, because they're just too early. It's not necessarily
they're either
their
too
fault.
early, too late. I love that you brought up logistics, Nicholas. I think that it is an underappreciated factor. And in marketing, it's sort of the bastard stepchild of the 4 Ps. When we talk about marketing, we always talk about product, price, place, and promotion. Right product at the right place, price, sold through the right channel, and promoted in a way that you want it and it's desirable. The one that just gets the least attention always is logistics, place. And during the 1920s, if you think about it for a second, this is the time where we had really, I think, one of the most important innovations in American history, the most undersung innovation, is the truck. Most people simply do not understand how important the kind of the innovation of the simple box truck really was, and the roads and everything that went along with it. But if you thought about how goods and services need to get around before then, you just need to look at a map. And the United States is massive, the 4th largest country in the world by area, certainly the most kind of widely populated, with different major group population centers in different areas. But how did things need to get around, right? I mean, since ancient times, it was mostly water, Water was the most efficient by far. Otherwise, you had it around caravans. Ask anyone who was on the Silk Road how safe that was and how effective that was. Water was key. Getting around by water has been so much of our history. We get to the railroads. Railroads are great, but if you think about the amount of infrastructure that needs to go in, the tracks, the locomotives, you just cannot be running trains as often as flexible as a truck. You think now the number of places a truck can go. I mean, there was a truck right outside my window the other day dropping off furniture to one of my neighbors. Think about how unthinkable that was in 1910. Utterly unthinkable. If you wanted furniture, like, you hooked up some horses, and like, it was hard to get things. It limited where people could live. It limited commerce in just untold ways. And today, we can essentially drive a truck anywhere. It's why drones never really took off. There aren't a lot of places trucks can't go, and they are super flexible. They're super efficient, and they're super capable of bringing anything to anybody, anywhere, at any time. Team that up with the people who figured out how to get things from place to place. We think Amazon is pretty cool today. Imagine doing everything Amazon does without zip codes in the United States. That's what Sears had to do. Sears figured out how to get stuff to people with no uniform postal codes on roads, via train, horses, dudes walking with backpacks. I mean, come on, you could write entire books, and people have, including the one you cited, on just logistics networks and how critical they are to real development, and how good logistics really means make or break in economic development.
So I watched a fantastic documentary on Sears and how they built up their catalogs, and how that catalog business just, again, and that was from about the 1880s or something like that as well.
Correct.
But only
1890s,
again,
yep.
1890s, but really exploded before the 20s and after it. I mean, you could get an entire house.
It was crazy.
Just ridiculous.
The craftsman house. People think there's this kind of architectural style, it's craftsman, and they don't really realize that that's a house you bought out of a catalog back then.
It's exactly this. Yeah, I mean, we think Amazon, as you mentioned, Amazon and these companies are trailblazers, but those Sears lot are just ridiculous. Now, I want to touch on something I mentioned earlier, which is cold chain, and you talk about flash frozen vegetables. I think that's the Jolly Green Giant or one of those businesses.
Birdseye, yes.
Birdseye. Going back into your genealogy, you've got some cold chain dependent ancestors as well, in terms of Neapolitan ice cream. So maybe talk, that's a great grandfather saying. So that must have been around maybe a bit after this time, but around this time.
Yeah, it's interesting when you think about these innovations that, kind of this combination of kind of technology innovation and then kind of value chain, and how all of that works. And what's interesting about Clarence Birdseye, and I touch on him in the book, there's a great book by Mark Kurlansky that talks about The Curious Man. It's a great one. You pick it up and just read more about Clarence Birdseye specifically. But what he figured out, and if everyone knows this, if you actually freeze something in your freezer, let's say you have leftovers, you have a pot roast or whatever, and you put it in your freezer and you take it out the next day and you reheat it, what does it taste like? Mush. And the reason it tastes like mush is that it cools down too slowly. And when water freezes, it expands. It's one of the very few liquids that does that. It's just physics. There's nothing you can do about it. But the slower it cools down, the bigger it gets, up to about 9% of its volume, which is not great if you want to, because inside of little food and the cells will break, and that's what makes it taste like mush. What Birdseye figured out when he was stationed in Labrador, Canada, is that if you cooled things down fast enough, like from 0 to -40 in a few seconds, you might only get 0.5% of that increase in volume. So you can actually reheat things and they don't taste as bad. And that's what the Inuit people taught him up there is freeze it fast and fish taste just about as good. Here's the deal. Here's what's important about what you say the cold chain and more broadly a value chain. Just because you have something like that and you think, wow, that's cool, people will automatically trust things that I freeze and then they can reheat at home. Think about that for a second. Number one, I have no idea. All I know about freezing things is it's not good. I also know that it only works in the winter. I know that if I've had ice cream, it's not really food safe. Lots of people get sick from ice cream in that era because it's not really well controlled. I don't have a refrigerator at home, by the way. I certainly don't have a freezer. And neither does the grocery store I'm going to. So if you think about kind of the cold chain, you have to think about that not just from, okay, in a factory, I can use calcium carbonate, kind of a solution to kind of create an endothermic reaction that will cool things down really fast, and I can get it cold. Well, what if the train that carries it or the truck that carries it doesn't have an air conditioner, can't keep it frozen? The grocery store can't keep it frozen. You can't keep it frozen. Where does it go? So Birdseye's invention might have been the flash freezing process, but his innovation was creating a value chain that would allow you to bring that to market and convince people once you did that it was still safe, it was still healthy, it was still fresh, it still tasted good. That was the real work. It was just it's a tremendous story, but if you don't think about it in terms of the value chain, the entire process from kind of point A to point B, you missed the point. It wasn't about freezing things. It was about keeping it cold the whole way that really related to a dozen little innovations and challenges along the way. That's why he's worth reading about. That's true innovation.
Yeah, that's a fascinating story. And again, as you said, each step in that chain has to work. Otherwise, your product or innovation is literally pointless. And I'll give you a nice example of the importance of cold chain and how we take cold chain for granted. I worked in Nigeria with a HIV/AIDS organization and another couple of NGOs that were sending vaccines for polio and things like that around Nigeria. And there's no cold chain. So you get into Lagos, which is a big city. It's got fridges, it's got a bit of electricity, etc. But as soon as you go 20 kilometers out, 30 kilometers out, nothing. The roads are trash. Everything is the cold chain collapses in a heap. And how do you get these vials of life-saving medicine to communities around the area? And what very smart people, they saw that the mobile phone operators, which are all around the country, all of their servers by their towers are cooled with air conditioning. So what they did is they had an engagement with the tower owners, and they would go and they would have a fridge, and they would use those towers, AC and refrigerator sort of cold rooms, in order to get longer life on these vials, because they also degrade in high temperatures. So that cold chain, I think we take it for granted, but just a couple of years ago there was no such thing.
Yeah, I think it's when you think about a lot of innovations that just seem like, oh, that's really cool, but it's just missing some connection from kind of one place to the next. We see that all the time, that it's really when a number of different new innovations kind of come together that, like, that's why some things can just be ahead of their time. And I spent time in fiber optics in the 1990s. That was kind of my business then. And we were at least in the United States, I think it was this way in the EU and other parts of the world as well, we were burying fiber. We just couldn't bury it fast enough. Just putting in glass upon glass upon glass, hundreds and hundreds of strands of fiber optic cable that I talked with a colleague of mine who I used to work with back then, and he said, you know what? We are just lighting up the fiber we put in the ground 20 years ago. And what that means is that they are just finding uses for it. It was so overbuilt at that time. It was so ahead of its time that you were barely using it when it went in the ground. And it was just that foresight to think, okay, 20, 30, 50 years from now, we're going to need this. That's kind of the idea behind the interstate highway system in the United States, the Autobahn in Germany. It was the Great Road in China. I mean, all of these things are decades-long infrastructure projects, because if you just don't have them, it slows everything else down in ways that are unpredictable. They're hard to know where you'll find the bottleneck, but you will run into them.
Yeah. Well, if we look at that example, the going to space, we've got Elon Musk and his spaceships still using liquid fuel and stainless steel covers for his pointy spaceships. It's old technology, but being utilized in different ways, and it's a long game. This is going to take us a while to there's going to be that consilience period where everything comes together, and we're just going to be all of us in space and running around. Now, I want to touch on, I mean, you've got such great topics here. So one of them, which I really loved, was the 5-cent trip to hell. And because when you look at the 20s, it's not just the consumer is changing in its entirety from a social perspective in terms of access to healthcare, access to new thinking, new thoughts, new politics, and all of this mass media that you spoke about. So there's some really amazing things here in terms of this 5-cent trip to hell, which I just love that, and that's in reference to the cost of it, or the price of a movie ticket, I take it.
Yeah, that was the price of a Nickelodeon. And when people think like, oh, where does that word come from? It was a 5-cent. You put it in your nickel, and you could get a little show on a little Nickelodeon device. Some movie tickets cost more than that, but it's all Hollywood, right? And during that time, during the 1920s, you had kind of the birth of Hollywood, the birth of radio and other media. There's just this explosion in media and entertainment and information. It wasn't just about things you bought. It's competing for your dollar. It's entertainment competing for your time. So people think about I think when most people think about consumption, they're thinking about it far too narrowly and just from an economic point of view. They're not thinking about it from what is competing for your mindset and your limited attention. And Hollywood was interesting at this time. It was this it's the time where you first had this cultural tension develop between more of a religious, conservative, kind of God-fearing, traditionalist sort of perspective, and more of a liberal, progressive, pleasure-seeking sort of perspective on the other. And in many ways, we all try to kind of graft our current culture war on any other era, and it's a lot more complicated than that. And what I would say about that particular era is that the general conventional wisdom, and most conventional wisdom is wrong, unfortunately, in this case is no different. The conventional wisdom is that as Hollywood grew, people became less religious. They became more secular, and that they kind of turned away from the church because the church obviously could not compete with a movie. How awesome does a church service need to be in order to compete with Gone with the Wind or The Godfather or anything like that? The reality, though, is that people actually did more of both. What was interesting, the evidence shows that, yes, people went to the movies. It was huge. And more people went to the movies every week, and they would go multiple times per week. You had no TV, by the way. You had radio, but this was key. But people actually went to church more on Sundays. Church attendance and church membership did not decline during that same time, and actually tended to go up. So what people were choosing was, okay, I could go to the movies during the week and I could go to church on Sunday. It was just more of yes, churches and kind of religious doctrine needed to evolve to kind of a new reality of the number of choices we had in our lives. They needed to become more relevant. But to think that people were turning away from the church is not correct. What they were maybe turning away from was a very archaic view of the church that assumed that everyone was on a farm and would stay on the farm within 5 miles of that farm from the time they were born till the time they died. Well, the church needed to become relevant in terms of how it was going to address poverty, how it was going to address racism, how it was going to address exploitation, how it was going to address the union movement. And churches became more relevant during that time. We especially see that in the 1930s, for sure. But even during the 1920s, churches were trying to figure out how they fit into this. And as they figured it out, people did go to church, and they went to church even more often in the 1930s as things got bad, which tells us that, yes, there was this kind of tension between these things, but the American consumer, the choice maker, said, I can choose both things.
Again, societal changes and similarities that we see today. I mean, I'm sure church attendance is way down in the States now. Perhaps in certain areas it's growing, and especially with new population groups growing, like the Hispanic population, more Catholic churches, probably more religious revivals in certain areas. So it's this sort of swing of the pendulum, and it's fascinating looking at the sociological side of, how consumerism affects society. Now, another chapter is marketer in chief. So why don't we just have a quick chat?
But getting back to kind of marketer in chief and the idea behind marketer in chief, and I have a chapter in the book on marketer in chief, which is the same title as the much larger book of the same name. Part of it was relevant for the 1920s, and it saved me from writing another. There are already 26 chapters in the book, all these little case histories, and that kind of saved me a little time. So it's just a little writer tip from writer to writer, that being able to kind of move a little bit of content in from one to the other. It's just one chapter, though. There are 25 other good ones. Why it's relevant. Consumer culture impacted how we treat politics as well. What Bruce Barton figured out about Calvin Coolidge was that he could package Calvin Coolidge like he were a breakfast cereal or a new toaster or a car. Yeah, that Calvin Coolidge had features that would appeal to different audiences, and that they were making the vote was essentially a purchase, not a literal purchase. That's bribery, and of course that happened in different places, but really what was happening is he thought about Coolidge like a product, not like a politician. And we talk about, well, what specific innovations? Well, this is the first time where the politician had different messages for different audiences. He talked with business people different than he talked with women's groups, different than he talked with black groups, different than he talked with Jewish immigrants. All of these people had a different message and a different part that would appeal to them. And he was enormously successful. Let's just, kind of skip to the end. Calvin Coolidge easily won in 1924 on his own he came to the presidency after Warren Harding died, and easily won, though, his own elections.
And this is, again, tying in the skills that these communications folks brought back from the war and the jumpstart of these advertising agencies like J. Walter Thompson.
That's correct. Bruce Barton is one of the founding members of BBDO, which is, Barton is B, the first B. So again, it's not surprising that this kind of choice culture and this sort of consumer mindset wouldn't seep into all the different areas. So when we think about today, we think about these information bubbles that people are in, and we think about people see the world differently. They have a different set of facts. They have, and we're all on Twitter about that. We're all nervous about that. That has been going on for 100 years. That is nothing new. We have been in our own little information bubbles a long, long time. And if people think, well, back in the 50s, we only had 3 network stations. We had hundreds of newspapers, literally hundreds. Every major city had 2, 3, maybe 4 or 5 different newspapers. We had magazines. If you think about the media landscape, we over-focus on television. during the 1950s and 60s. And we think that everyone knew and believed the same things at that time. That is complete bunk. Our media landscape has been diverse and complicated and incomprehensible since the 1920s. And we've been fine since then. And we will be fine today.
Just a bit of trivia. My great-grandfather worked for JWT in Cape Town on the Ford account. And this must have been in the 20s when
they just got it. Yeah.
When they just got it, yeah. So, I mean, and unfortunately, JWT is no more because it joined up with Wunderman and JWT Wunderman, and then it's now VML. So that's another one.
Kind of sad. Yeah.
Yeah,
kind of
bites
sad.
the dust. And I worked at JWT. So
what a storied history.
Yeah,
some of the best people. There's a chapter in the book that recounts the story of Helen Lansdowne Resner, probably the best copywriter, one of the best copywriters of the 20th century. Not the best woman copywriter, one of the best copywriters of the 1920s, or really the last century, who was JWT. Yeah, that company produced so many campaigns, so many people. It produced the Book of the Month Club and just so many other subscription business models. There's so much that came out of JWT. They're a really fascinating organization.
Well, your tattoo titles kill me. So the one on advertising with Helen is called Mad Women. So don't get upset, everyone. It's based on Mad Men. So we're just balancing it out a little bit. But Jason, there's such fascinating stuff here. Who is the ideal target market for this book?
I think what's part of why I wrote this is that I felt like people misunderstood consumer culture. It's kind of like asking a fish to describe water. It's all around you, but you don't really understand it. So we are very likely, when we don't understand something, to ascribe really negative things to it. What we don't understand, we fear and we hate. And what I see is kind of two unproductive things. When people talk about consumer culture, on one side, it's all about macroeconomics and about supply chain economics and this kind of very pro-business side and pro-innovation and this kind of worshiping at the technology altar. You see that side. And then on the other side, you see this kind of pure exploitation, that capitalism is evil and that it's horrible to people and we need to get rid of it. And none of those perspectives, they're not necessarily right and they're not necessarily wrong, but they're sort of missing the point. And it's like they're both trying to describe something that doesn't describe the experience that most people have with consumer culture and with choice culture. There are kind of these everyday decisions people make. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to understand them myself. That's obviously my business. But I wanted to help other people understand them. This is Boo's Babe in the Little Black Dress is the story of your everyday life and why it is the way it is. And if you don't understand why, and you don't understand the power you've been given as a choice maker, you are not likely to be able to use it. I think this is the kind of book that when people think, hey, I want to be a better business person, read it, because it will help you understand how to be a better business person and understand consumer behavior. If you think, I want to tear down this system of capitalism and oppressive and exploitation, read the book, because you'll understand how consumers' minds work. Because if you think, I'm going to take away all your choices for this better world, people will tell you, and you can clip this out if you like, fuck that. I want nothing to do with that. Don't tell me I can't make choices. Like, if you want to tear down that system, that economic system, great. But if you're going to replace it with something that doesn't give people choices, don't be surprised if people go tell you where to put it. So I think that if you want to make change, whether you want to be better, you want to change the system, but you don't understand how a consumer mind works and where that all started, you're not going to be effective. So I want people who want to make change and who want to make things better. This will help them get there faster.
Jason, this is such a wonderful primer for exactly what you've mentioned. I mean, it's also in juicy, bite-sized pieces. So it's not going to overwhelm you with too much, but it gives you quite a there's a nice theme running through it, obviously, and it's set in that specific era, but absolutely vital and absolutely relevant to where we are today. So I would honestly, and having read all of the summaries and some of the sections, there's just some fantastic stuff there. And things that you can impress your friends with. Again, when you're arguing with liberals or arguing with people on the right, you've got a bit of ammo for that. Well, Jason, where can folks buy your wonderful book?
I think the best place to find my books are on Amazon. It's the easiest place for most people. You can buy it anywhere in the world, especially electronically. That's the easiest one. Just search for Booze, Babe in the Little Black Dress. You can do that. Or if you want to follow me more kind of day to day, find me on LinkedIn. Jason Voiovich, I'm the only one. Kind of like Tigger, I'm the only one. So I am very easy to find. Or go to Innovation History on Substack, where I write about that a little bit more regularly. Things that will never fit in a book or things that are just too off topic, kind of the weird stuff, all goes there. So if the 26 chapters in Booze, Babe in the Little Black Dress, you're like, I want it even weirder, go to Innovation History on Substack.
Well, I'm going to put those links into the description so folks can go hog wild and binge read your content. Jason, it's been such a treat chatting to you, and I'm sorry to have taken up so much of your time, but what a very enjoyable chat for me as well. So thank you so much for your time, and I hope folks go and buy both those books, and that you go and get your popcorn ready.
Thanks a lot, Nicholas. I really, really enjoyed being here. I could talk about it all day, so no time restrictions. Time restrictions are the amount of time that someone's on the treadmill right now, and they're getting ready to get off the treadmill. That's always the ideal podcast length, right?
Yeah.
Kind of the treadmill. So hopefully you're fully in zone 2 cardio right now. Good on you. We'll wrap it up.
Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you up on that, and we're going to have a marathon session, but I think I'll have to come to the States, or you can come visit us in Norway, and we can do that in studio. Jason,
That sounds good.
it's been real. Bye.
Bye.